we recorded our first 3 in this series of a partnership between Fostering Together and OEO. And the other 3 are posted both directly on our website and also on our YouTube channel. If you go to the website, that's where you'll also find the PowerPoints. And like I said, I'll send out the materials for this afterward. And we're recording for tonight so other folks can sign in. And again, I just want to start with a big thank you to Jill for helping facilitate this partnership and this series, and to helping to gather questions for tonight. So we last year did a series of Ask an Ombuds webinars where we had invited folks to send questions in advance, and so we did that again with this particular focus. So thank you to everyone who sent questions. Thank you to everyone who's signing on. And I do get clearly the sense year after year that, you know, a lot of questions are similar. Certainly there's some different ones that come up now and then, but many folks have similar questions. So let's dive in. We have an hour and a half for tonight. If you get tired midway and you need to go take a break, get something to eat, please do. Or if you want to eat while you're listening, please do. I have thought about it, and I think there may be a way as we get toward the end, especially if we have some good time, that I could make it so attendees could talk or raise a hand. We might have a little bit of technical fidgeting with that, but we can try to make it happen. I would just encourage, remember we are recording and it's going to go up on our website and live there. So feel free. And you, of course, are welcome to use chat and or the Q&A feature to ask questions as we go along and as we get to the end. Okay, so today, you know, I'm Rose Spidell with the Office of Education Ombuds, and we're a small state agency. We're more than a decade old now and work on addressing the opportunity gap in K-12 public schools. We know that foster youth, the ones that you all support and love and care for, are some of those who unfortunately fall into those cracks and gaps in our system that haven't filled in yet to wrap around and get them the support, as many of them as need it. So how do we make that better? How do we improve outcomes for kids? You asked a lot of important questions about how to do that. And the first one that I wanted to start with today was, it just seems like a central question that came up in our last one, which is, I had a scenario looking at a student who was struggling. The school was responding to his behavior and imposed some discipline, and there were questions about what's going on here. Could this be a dynamic of whether or not there's a need for more trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive response on the part of the school? And someone said, well, great. So what if there is a need for that? What are the resources? What could I do, say, if I were a foster parent and I'm supporting this young person and I'm realizing that they're in a school that hasn't yet really had a lot of training on how to approach things in a trauma-informed way, or hasn't quite gotten where we need them to be? What could I do? What could I offer to the school? What could I ask for from them? So that's the first question. I'm going to look at, how does you get a district to pay for outside testing? Does a school district need to provide support for a student who speaks only Spanish? What do you do about a teen who's been moved around so much that you just don't even really know what they know, where they're at academically? How can you get a snapshot of that? What about a kid in elementary school, been falling behind for quite a while now, but we're hearing they don't qualify for an IEP or 504. We don't have sort of a specific, clear diagnosis. And then we have several questions that hopefully we'll get to some of these, especially those first 2 on this screen. How do we help kids, especially teens, navigate districts or schools different kinds of responses to behavior escalations, especially, you know, if you have a child who's been experiencing trauma, they might be triggered, and especially if a district's response is or feels very punitive or controlling, that sometimes trigger further escalation. And what can we do to support teens who are trying to navigate that? And then what if you're working with a young person, they've been moving from school to school, you worry and wonder if a disability might be playing into their challenges with school, whether it's academic or social or behavior. But the school's saying, hey, look, this is a kid who's just experiencing trauma. Let's just give them some time. We don't want to rush. We don't want to rush to label as disabled or as a child with a disability. So how can you navigate that conversation? And then also kind of following on some of our earlier conversations, what if it just seems pretty clear that educators are not following the rules that are there? What are the ways to seek accountability or consequences for the educators? And then lots of changes now in discipline policy and how to engage with that. All right. The trauma-informed schools. First thing I'll say is I am certainly not the very far from the most well-informed on this piece, but I will say that in a lot of different meetings, work groups, etc., people really are talking about this. Now, again, a lot of times there's a critical distinction between talking about and really doing and shifting practice. But starting with this idea that I looked at the SAMHSA kind of description of what it really even means to be trauma-informed, because I think that's often a critical starting point to not jump over, which is if I say to my child's school, you know, has your staff been trained on trauma-informed practices? And they say yes. If I were to ask, then what does trauma-informed practice mean to you? Would we come up with the same idea, understanding, or definition? So here, SAMHSA describes it as a program, organization, or system. It realizes the widespread impact of trauma, understands paths for recovery, recognizes signs and symptoms of trauma, and that here might be in students, but also families, responds by integrating knowledge about how to infuse that trauma understanding into policies and procedures, and also seeks actively to resist re-traumatization. So there's a whole lot more there. But what are some more sort of specific ideas if you are that person who wants to engage your school community or your district community about increasing the competency, the comfort level, the capacity, and the understanding of the educators and adults to understand and respond in a trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive way? And I think about these things in the sense of thinking about, okay, if we wanted to start this conversation with a school, or often what we might find, and I think increasingly so, if we wanted to join a conversation that maybe has started in bits and pieces and has different people looking at it, some resources going towards it, maybe some pockets of focus, how can we do that? Who would we talk with? Who would we start with? And you know, here on the slide, I've listed some folks who I think by their position might invite that conversation potentially. But I also, so we have foster care liaisons. So every school district now under the federal Every Student Succeeds Act must identify a foster care liaison. So someone who within the district is familiar with protections for students in foster care and can kind of help navigate that. So maybe the foster care liaison at the district level, the school building principal, a school social worker, school counselor, school psychologist, or other district leaders. And in a conversation recently that actually happened at the state work group on social emotional learning, it's the work group that's being facilitated right now by OSPI, I was having a conversation with folks about this. Number one, there's a social worker who's on the committee, and I'm starting a conversation to see if we might come back at some point later this year or next and offer up some more specific conversation and training around ways that families can initiate this conversation with schools and resources, specific resources that you can ask the school to look at with you. But think also, if you were going to want to try to start this conversation or just see where things are at within your school community, you might start with someone who has one of these titles or formal roles. But you might also just kind of think, you know, kind of imagine the meetings you've had, the conversations you've had, and it might be a teacher, it might be someone with a role that's not so specific, but just really seem to get it, seem to have interest and or experience. Because sometimes if you find the champion of that idea, of that resource, whatever their role is within the school, they can introduce you to others who are interested. They can join you in introducing the idea and a request to someone who is in a leadership position, like the principal. So I would think about, maybe jot down a note of 1 or 2 people that you might call. You might be cold calling someone in one of these positions. Like, you might be cold calling the foster care liaison, say, hey, I'm taking care of a child who's at this elementary school, and I'm wanting to have this conversation about how to make sure that the adults that are surrounding this child understand the impact of trauma and how to support this child in a positive way. What do you think? Can we talk about that? Sometimes it's just about starting the conversation. The next thing I think about is how would you start that conversation? And I do think there's benefit to acknowledging that there might already be stuff happening. I say that in part because our state legislature this year is considering a number of bills that would put trauma-informed training or training on trauma-informed practices into a lot of different places within our education system, for paraeducators, for certificated teachers, for general school staff to just really understand and appreciate what it means to have trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive practice. Now, just because it goes into legislation doesn't mean that it happens, but one thing I will say is things like that don't usually go into legislation until there have already been some leaders in the field pushing this forward and championing it as a need. And so, indeed, I think if you're able to start that conversation with someone within your school or district, you might find someone who's started to connect and could join you in that push for more. The other thing I would think about here, and I earlier mentioned that I had some of these conversations at the social emotional learning work group, is to think about where you might sort of capitalize, kind of build on what the district might be already investing in. So there's often so many connecting points. So if a district is talking a lot about social emotional learning, you might be able to find out, are they thinking about making sure that the approaches on that are trauma informed? So could you engage the conversation there? Or as districts are, if they're talking about revising and reviewing their discipline policies, I really hope that they are all thinking about, how do we make sure these discipline policies are trauma informed? So in other words, can we build a discipline policy that from the outset recognizes that some of the kids that are here in our school buildings might engage in behaviors that are reflective of having had a traumatic experience and responding to the context and the environment? What would we do if we were going to build a policy that had that from the beginning? And one of the things I would say too is, if you're having these conversations, if there's any way you can bring it together as a group voice. So it might feel sometimes, I've heard some people say, look, when I'm advocating for an individual child, whether it's around a child with disabilities or a child in foster care, a child who's experiencing discipline or bullying, sometimes the tendency of a large system is to say, we are only talking about this individual child, and we are only talking about this individual particular circumstance. This one incident, this one child, this one group with this one team. And to be honest, that can make it difficult, right? I'm sure you know this, to shift the overall culture, shift the dynamic, right? So what you're advocating with that individual child, and then you bump up against a discipline policy that hasn't taken into account the reality that your child and others are there and have been impacted by trauma. So you won't, in that individual case, probably be able to rewrite the discipline policy. But maybe after you get that situation resolved, and in all your free time, with all your free energy, I say that a little bit sarcastically because I know that you're already carrying a lot, you connect with others, whether it's an organization or a group of families, someone in the community that says, you know what, there's a better way to do this from the beginning. So I think about collective voice, connecting to ongoing efforts. How can I help build this? And then what about some specifics? tried hard to resist the urge to populate this slide with about 8 different links and resources. And so I picked out just 2. And this is where I want to try to actually switch over and navigate to some of these resources directly. So let's see if I can do this. I'm going to hit New Share, and we're going to look at the websites. And we're not at the right one yet, but we're going to go right to Learning and Teaching. Now, can folks there, can you see the OSPI website? Yes, yes, yes. The PowerPoint will be available to view after. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll have those links in there. So can folks see, did I do the share right, where you're looking at the Compassionate Schools, the Heart of Learning and Teaching? Okay, great. So this is one resource on, it's focused on training the adults within a school setting to provide support for students who have been impacted by trauma. I shared this one because it's local, it's Washington State. It is based out of OSPI. There's options here, right? You can go on the website, and if you had a conversation with folks in your district, it's possible if we click on resources here, there's training materials online, so they can be accessed that way. You can also, I'm gonna hit back, I'm gonna highlight to the left of the screen here is contact information. So OSPI does have this one person, Ron Hertel. He's been the lead around this issue, and he does go around and do trainings on it. This is one of many more. I think within your school and district community, you might find other trainers, other resources, because again, this is, I think it's growing in awareness and familiarity. This could be a place for you to start, could be a helpful resource. It might be that your district has already done some work with this, or they would be open to it. The other resource that I wanted to share before we go back to the PowerPoint is a resource from SAMHSA. That is a long acronym that I don't remember, but it is a really important agency that shares out a lot of resources around mental health. Somebody will remember it better than I do. They have a number of different resources. There's this one I found on the website of Traumainformedcareproject.org. And this is their concept of trauma and guidance for a trauma-informed approach. The reason I highlighted this one is if you really want to dig in and you want to have a conversation, and let's say you get some building leaders and principals, maybe someone at the district level, to work with you and say, let's figure this out. This resource, and again, I'm sure many others, includes some information and some kind of checklists and some touchstones to check and review and see, do we have all the pieces in place, right? So it's training for adults, but it's also looking at policy. So if I scroll down a ways, we're going to find some sections that, for example, sample questions to consider when implementing a trauma-informed approach. And it looks at a number of different domains. This gets pretty dense, pretty complicated, right? But it's the kind of resource that's out there. And what I would say is, if you have that opportunity to dig in and engage with the school community, connect to those local resources, connect to the state, and find something, whether it's this one or another one, that reminds you to check all these different areas: policy, practice, training. Are there ways to put messages up around that are visible? That communication back and forth between families and schools. There's a lot of elements when you want to do this systemically and do it well. So let's go back to our PowerPoint. Okay. Trauma-informed schools. I just want to pause. Are there folks who have a favorite resource around trauma-informed practice or engaging with schools on this, or a favorite, or someone that's just absolutely your go-to? If you have that and it's at hand and you're open to share, if you could type it into chat, we can share it out to this group. And otherwise, I think, again, be each other's supports in this as you connect and continue the conversation. If you're interested in policy, you might try to find some groups that are engaged at the policy level, because there are conversations about whether and how our state should invest resources, more resources, in supporting our schools to become more trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. All right. So again, if you have your favorite resource or a follow-up question on this, please put that in now. And then I'm going to go ahead and go on to this next question. It is excellent. So the next question is around independent evaluations. And thank you for the comment. Learning about the foster liaison was crucial. And that foster liaison, I would say, it's a new role, right? And so it's going to be taking shape. The other thing is that each district is figuring out who is going to fill that role. And that person, I would bet for almost all districts, maybe not all of them, but for most, that person is also probably has another job, right? And so how are they going to fill that role of foster care liaison? What are going to be their priority issues? Engage that conversation if you can. And if you are, again, if there's a group of you, a group of foster families that serve kids in your area, and you could invite the foster care liaison to have lunch with you one day, so that you all know names and faces, so that you have contact information. The foster care liaison may say, hey, look, this is my priority, but I want to hear from you as we go along. Or they may say, well, your asks and your ideas are really critical. I just don't have the resources. And then you might be able to go with the foster care liaison to the superintendent or to the school board and say, we need this. So, and thank you for the comment, a teacher and understanding this conversation when it comes to behavior. This is so critical, because if we don't understand the behavior, I think it influences and informs a lot of the changes recently. We just keep doing the same thing and not getting good results. And so there's just this desire to see kids succeed, and that means that we have to kind of shift our approach sometimes on these things as adults. The fostering together liaison can also connect people to schools. So yeah, so you've got some resources there. Let's dig into this independent eval question. And let me just actually, though, before I do, so we have, Jill shared the fostering together liaison can connect people to the schools. Jill, can you let us know if you have a chance to type a little bit more? Is the fostering together liaison someone that works outside of the school, sort of separate? And that would be someone who's in addition to the foster care liaison who works for the school district? So that's a question back to Jill. We'll see if she has a chance to answer. In the meantime, what if you have a child who has a complex set of needs, and they include disability, and they've been evaluated, the school district did their evaluation, and you're just really not seeing it as giving accurate or complete information about this child? We do hear that sometimes families worry that the evaluation of a child that a school district does might be unfairly, kind of take an unfair view of the child as willfully misbehaving, as opposed to really understanding the complex factors that play into that. And so it's not uncommon to hear, how can I get an independent evaluation or an outside evaluation for this child, especially, again, if their needs are really complex? So I can think of two ways. There may be more. The first way is, and here we're thinking about special education specifically, is that when a district agrees to do an evaluation to see if a student needs special education, or even if you're doing a reevaluation for a student who's had special education services for a while, and you're doing the periodic 3-year reeval or an early reevaluation. And in some situations, you can have that conversation with the school district before the evaluation process starts to say, is this a child whose needs are so complex or specialized or unique that we need someone with specialized training or experience to do an evaluation. Is this the kind of evaluation that a school psychologist, well, generally trained and able to do most of those special ed evaluations, doesn't have that experience or expertise? That certainly might come up if a child had a medical condition that the team really needed to understand in order to be able to understand how that influences the educational performance. And let me point out here that that might mean information about a child's mental health situation, right? So the special ed rules, when you're looking from the outset, say two things that potentially apply here, which is one, the evaluations have to be done by trained and knowledgeable personnel. Again, that's usually the school psychologist, occupational therapist, speech language pathologist, other folks who work for the school district. In some cases, there may be a student with needs and situations that mean we need a very specialized kind of evaluation. And in that case, the district, it's not an independent evaluation, but the district can contract with someone outside of the district to do the district's own part of the evaluation, to do their own evaluation. The other time, again, is if there might need to be a medical assessment included. And a school psychologist does not make medical diagnoses or do medical assessments. So that might involve the district saying, let's bring in this specialized medical professional and get this information. The other, and maybe more common, I'm not sure, is through a request for an IEE, or Independent Educational Evaluation, at district expense. The definition of an independent educational evaluation is just one that's done by someone who doesn't work for the district. And so sometimes you can go out and get that on your own if you have insurance or a program that provides it. And then if you get that report, you share it with the district and they must consider it if it's relevant. Or if you want to ask the district to pay for it, then it keys this particular process. And so I am going to do some jumping around again. Hope you won't feel like we might be a little bit in one of those shows that jump you from forward to back. As I jump, I want to let you know that yes, Jill says yes, the fostering together folks know the foster school liaisons, and so connect, those are good points of connection. So let's move back to the web. Why? Because rather than just tell you about the independent education evaluation, I want to show you where you can go to find information. So we started here, but we're going to open a new tab. We're going to go to special education. So if you were starting from Googling, you could just put in OSPI special education. Are folks seeing that landing page for OSPI special education? If you're seeing it, it starts out with special ed, it has laws and procedures. Yes, excellent. Okay, if you're supporting a child who has special education services or might need special education services, this is a good website to be familiar with. It has a lot of different kinds of information, contact information, resources, and specifically, we're talking about independent educational evaluations. And in the guidance for families section, you can click on evaluations right here. It's going to take you here, and there are 3 different types that I'll tell you about. And one of them is that independent educational evaluation. And then you can find out, okay, if I ask for an IEE, the district has 15 calendar days to respond. If they say no, they must file for a due process hearing to show that their own evaluation was appropriate. This one, I think, I skipped over a part that I think is really important if you want to ask for an IEE, is it's not required to be in writing, but it is encouraged to be in writing, okay? So if you want to get an IEE, it's best practice to put it in writing, and that can be an email. I'd be very clear. So the risk is if it's not clear that you're asking for an IEE at public expense, it might be interpreted differently. If you want the IEE at public expense, I would be just as clear as type up your email and the subject would say, request for IEE. just that simple, and be clear in the email. So here we have a really helpful comment, which is that, you know, as parents, you're carrying a lot, and I really don't mean to be flip about that. You know, you think about being a foster parent, you are providing space, safety, love, care, support, and then you're getting to know a child, and then you're also trying to understand what are the different things that are influencing this child. If it's a disability, then you're trying to understand what does that mean, and what does it mean for this child, and how can I get access to educational support. And then if you run into problems, then it's almost as though you're trying to figure out how to, like the commenter here says, become the experts. Become the experts on what these laws and rules are. And I think I try to kind of keep perspective, which is that in my job, I mostly hear when things are not going well, or when people feel like they haven't accessed that support that they need. I do think, and I hope that in some places, in many places, those things are happening, so it doesn't come up. But when it does, then doing this research, becoming familiar with this, can really help. You get familiar with the IEE term, right? And you get familiar with doing the written advocacy, and you know what that phrase was to request something. And that can make a difference because it focuses attention right away. And that takes a lot of time. So I guess I would just say again, as you're going through this process, hopefully there'll be people alongside with you. But I do say, you know, and I try not to be too heavy on you need to read this and read that. Having familiarity, knowing that the OSPI special education website has this information, then you don't need to memorize it. If you have that question, you go back to it. The other place you can also look, and we're continually trying to make our information more accessible, is on our own website, the Education Ombuds website, and under our Learn About tabs. Okay, so that was our independent evaluations. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. Okay, I hope you're not getting dizzy. The next question we had was, what about if there's a child who is speaks only Spanish and needs access to education? So some young people, they might come when they're in kindergarten or first grade and speak only Spanish or another language other than English. Some young people might come to the United States first when they are a teenager, right? And they may speak little or no English. And sometimes if you have a newcomer who is a teenager, they may have had interrupted or very little formal education. So some of those kids are coming in and they are immediately being confronted with all kinds of new things, new language, new culture, new way of doing things, new rules, right? And so there's a lot that we need to wrap around and support them. The question was, does the school need to provide for a child who only speaks Spanish? And the answer is absolutely 100% yes. So the child, any child who is what we call an English learner, has rights, and districts have obligations to make sure that they have access to an education. And really, the second part of that question was, would they need to put someone with that language in the classroom? And maybe, possibly, in some situations, schools will do that. So, for example, you might have a middle schooler or a high schooler, even elementary, who is coming and they're Spanish speaking, they're just starting to learn English, but you want to give them access to math class, civics class, etc. Well, you can't just leave them there and have them incorporate all that academic language, much less just the English. And so sometimes schools will assign a paraeducator, a bilingual paraeducator, to be with them in that class and help them navigate through the language difference and be able to understand. I think that is a really hard thing to do. I don't think it's impossible. And I think in some other circumstances, they might do a mix of things. So they might pull the student out for a bit to provide language services. They might do some of that, providing the support within the classroom. There's some general guidance on several points around the rights of English learners and the obligations of school districts. And they highlight some things that I think are familiar to folks. We shouldn't separate them more than we need to from the general student population. Sometimes you might need to pull them out into a different setting to give them some very targeted and intensive instruction, both in English and in their primary language. But in general, you want to give them as much access to all the other school experiences as you can. So all those other classes with that support. This is another area where there's definitely champions in different schools and districts around doing the best kind of instruction for English learners. And there's also been attention to this at the state legislative level of how can we equip all classroom teachers to be ready to teach with strategies that support English learners and also support those people who are very specifically working with these students. For this, in this slide, I've included the link to the fact sheet from our U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights on the obligations to English learner students. They also have fact sheets around the rights of parents if they're limited English. But the next slide has some links back. And again, you're going to find me going back to OSPI's website, because there they have been collecting resources and they have had in the past an advisory committee, and I think they're continuing that. And they, especially recently, I've tuned in and noticed that they're doing a lot of proactive work to go out, share through webinars and other ways, kind of best practices, resources, how to do this well. Because whatever school that child lands in, whatever district, there's an obligation to serve the child. But some districts definitely have developed more structures and supports to do it quickly, efficiently, effectively, while other districts are sort of in the learning stages. So if you're supporting a child who's an English learner and you're feeling like the supports are not adequate or sufficient, think about, if you haven't already, reach out to your district's English learner department. You might think again about reaching out to some local community organizations, but also think about OSPI as a resource that potentially might be able to come in and provide some technical assistance or supports for your district. One thing I do want to show, so again, we're going to flip over here, so bear with me, don't get lost. We're going to show OSPI again on their migrant and bilingual education program. And what I want to highlight here in all this busyness is that if you look towards the left-hand side, there are different pieces. For people who are engaging with English learners who also have a disability or are suspected of having a disability, this gets just that another level of complex. I want to highlight that OSPI has been, they've put up some resources from some practitioners with expertise in this. And so again, I wouldn't say that you would need to be comfortable and familiar with these resources, but I would say that if you are there and you're asking for the evaluation for a young English learner who might have a disability, and you're not getting the sense that the school's done that before or knows what, kind of the best practices, let them know, hey, I heard OSPI has this resource now. Can I connect you with that? Or what do you think about reaching out to them? Or if you call OSPI and then you say, hey, can I introduce you to them? So you don't need to know the details of it, but knowing that that exists might help you share it over with the school, who could then incorporate that. All right, back we go. A current academic snapshot. So before I continue, I just keep running along. So let me know if questions come up about this as we go along, and we can pause and kind of add some more. I think we're going at a pace that will allow us to just do an open Q&A. So let's do this one, but again, add questions if you have them. What does a foster parent do about a teen who's been moved around so much and nobody knows where they're at educationally, and nobody in the school seems to want to take the time to find out? They might be 2 or more years behind. When I first was looking and thinking about this question, I was thinking a couple things. One, let's assume that this is a student without a disability. So there's no IEP, no 504, because if there were an IEP or a 504 and they've been moving around a lot and we don't know where they're at academically, we could ask via those teams to do an evaluation or an updated evaluation, right? And try to get some what we call present levels. Well, let's assume they don't, and we're kind of working within the general education world here. At first, I was really struggling because what would we do if this was a 5th grader, for example, or a middle schooler? And then I zeroed in on teens. So then that gave us potentially some other tools or resources to look at. For the younger students, I think you're really focusing on that classroom teacher, especially if they have only one classroom teacher, right? If they're elementary school and they have one primary teacher, that's the one you'll have to capture the attention, maybe with the assistance of the building principal or, again, the foster care liaison, to say, we do need to set aside the time to capture this academic snapshot. We need to know what their reading level is, where they're at with math, kind of generally, where do we dig in with them? And I say the foster care liaison because that is a person, again, who hopefully within that district conversation can focus and say, yeah, we do need to support this child, and really would be familiar with the fact that kids moving frequently, you're going to get some falling behind, but you're also maybe going to get some strange gaps, right? Oh, they might be really strong in this area of fractions, but they completely missed this other piece, and so adding the next one's going to be hard. So math especially, you might need to tease apart. For the teenager in high school or middle school, they're probably going to have more than one teacher. So you might be zeroing in on a couple of teachers. You know, a lot of times I think English, language arts, and math are going to be our 2 primary focuses. But you might want to know more generally. And so a school counselor might be someone who could help not necessarily do the academic kind of assessment to see where they're at, but to coordinate a group of people who would look at that. There also ought to be, as they get to the end of middle school and into high school, someone who's going to facilitate the high school and beyond plan. The high school and beyond plan is a current graduation requirement in the state, and it is pretty comprehensive. It really is looking beyond high school, but part of that is looking at what have I got done here, what's my plan in high school. And even if there's not a specific section of the high school and beyond plan that says let's assess where you're at currently, it could be a hook to get that conversation going. How can we plan well for this student if we don't know where we're starting from? And then I did include, again, another particular program page for OSPI. And again, the foster care education program, they have their specific page. That's where you can find the list of all the liaisons for the state. And you also can find a list of all the state laws, state and federal laws applying to kids in foster care. So bear with me. I'm going to go over there one more time. So here, we're going to leave the migrant bilingual. We're going to go over to foster care. Oops, there we are in foster care. You're going to find a contacts list for the liaisons, and you can do a control find to search by district or by county. We're also going to look on our left-hand side. We're going to see the program supervisors. So if you don't have the time to navigate all through their different sections of this website, give them a call, send them an email. I have a question about this. Can you point me in a good direction? And then one thing that catches my mind is one of the things that school districts are supposed to be doing with foster kids and the people who are supporting them, foster families, is taking a look at grade level progression and graduation. And so that, especially for high school aged youth, you're looking at, did they finish part of a class here? Can we give them part of that credit? And then add on to it here, so that when we piece the three pieces together, they get that whole semester of credit, even though they were in a few different places. And so to do that, you're going to need to know what they've learned and what they still need to learn. So those would be my thoughts on the, uh-oh, what happened here? I'm sorry. On the idea of how to help the student in figuring out the academic snapshot. Okay, so let's do this again. I'm going to go back. Okay, what about a child who has, yep, thanks, Jill. We lost that webpage. I am going to ask you all, I thought maybe navigating to websites would be helpful. If you think it's helpful to see the websites, I'll keep doing it. You've now seen OSPI several times. I can just point them out to you. That is one of the go-to websites because it is our state education department with lots of specific resources, contact people and everything. But if you're getting a little dizzy, you can say, let's stay in one place for a while. So now I hope you're seeing the PowerPoint again. So we had just talked, I'm going to circle back. So the current academic snapshot, I don't know of a specific reference that says, you need to do this, you need to do it now. But think about who those folks are. You can engage with it. Definitely foster care liaison. All right. And take a look at those different resources. Again, I find sometimes having a hook for it can be helpful in a conversation like this. Connecting it to something else, again, that high school and beyond plan. All right, so our next question takes us back into the realm of special education, potentially, understanding disability, evaluations, and things like that. So here's a question about, what about a child, imagine this one's in elementary school, who's failing and has been behind for a couple of years, yet doesn't qualify for an IEP or 504 because she doesn't have a diagnosis that we can pin this on, right? So we don't have maybe autism, we don't have ADHD, we don't have a diagnosis of whatever else, right? Just no specific diagnosis, but we've seen this student struggle year after year. And my first thought on this is, well, let's make sure that we're all remembering that eligibility for special education does not require any medical diagnosis. In fact, for some of them, you're thinking, really? So one of the categories of eligibility for special education is autism. So you think, well, gosh, in order to qualify and be eligible for special ed under autism, you must have to have that autism diagnosis from someone who's qualified. The way the education law is set up, it's actually not necessarily the case. So that diagnosis certainly can be helpful in answering one of the three parts to the question for determining if a child is eligible for special ed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are. And through the evaluation process, if there's enough information to show that they meet the definition of that child with a disability, then they could be found eligible even without the medical diagnosis. Now, if indeed having that clear medical diagnosis, a rule in or rule out, is really necessary to get a good comprehensive look at this child and what's influencing their educational progress, then it's on the district. It's on the district to make sure they can get that medical assessment or statement. It is not on the family to first get the diagnosis and then get access to an evaluation or an IEP, right? So if a medical diagnosis is needed to understand a student's needs, then that's part of the obligation of the district to ensure a full comprehensive evaluation. In this situation, again, one of the things that I definitely do, so there's two other things I want to say about this. One is, if I had the chance, I would ask all kinds of questions about this young student. What are the challenges? Are there particular academic areas of challenges? Are there social or emotional or behavior issues? Has the student shown some progress over time or not? And then understanding as much as we could, we might take a look right at the definition of child eligible for special education, because some of those eligibility categories, they're not going to depend on a medical diagnosis. Some of them, in fact, one of the areas is a specific learning disability. And one of the ways some students are identified as having a specific learning disability is that they've been receiving instruction and different types of intervention, and they're still just not making progress. And so they need a even more specialized kind of intervention. Whatever we do here, I have here on the slide, written advocacy, written notice. This definitely would be a time, if you haven't already, to just say, you know what, I'm going through this process again. I'm going to do all of my requests in writing and follow up. I'm certainly going to continue to have conversations, absolutely. But I'm going to make sure I do clear written requests, and I'm not going to stop asking until I get a clear written response. So in the last session, we talked about prior written notices. They come after a decision, but prior to its implementation. There's very specific requirements in the rules around prior written notices. A district is obligated to give a parent a prior written notice anytime it proposes or refuses to do an evaluation under special ed, or change placement, or change services, right? And so part of the written notice is that they have to explain what the decision is and the reasons for the decision, other options considered and rejected, and why they were rejected. So here, let's do a little dance over, see if I can keep you this time. We're going to go back to the web. And this time I'm actually, this is maybe going to be the most obnoxious. I'm going to take you right to the special education rules. Why is that obnoxious? Well, because, you know, there is a lot there. And I have it marked on my website or my internet, so I can click up and find all of them here and click back and forth. Near the top is child with a disability or student eligible for special education, and that is where you find all the definitions for the different categories. And if we click on that, we're going to find each of the different eligibility categories that a student might fall within. Autism, there's deafblindness, deafness, developmental delay. If this child is young enough, if they're not 9 years old yet, then indeed sometimes you're doing an assessment not to get a diagnosis, but to identify, are they significantly behind, very significantly behind in one area, or somewhat significantly behind in 2 or more areas of development. There's also emotional behavior disability with a specific definition, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple, orthopedic, and then other health impairment. So sometimes this definitely comes up. You might have a young person who there's been suspicion that they have ADHD, so, but you might not have a formal diagnosis. But you could still ask for an evaluation. The other health impairment, and again, if they needed to pin that down, rule it in, rule it out, they could ask to make sure that they can get access to a medical assessment. It's having limited strength, vitality, or alertness, right? It's this idea that this health issue, and they do specifically identify attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is influencing negatively their academic or educational performance. Just highlight here, so it also has asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, heart conditioning. There's a number of others. And what I'll say is, we normally wouldn't think about diabetes, say, as impacting your ability to make progress in reading, right? like you're thinking about the kind of common understanding and we don't see the connection. Or maybe with epilepsy. But let's say if you live with and are taking care of a child who has diabetes that has not been well treated or well managed, and it definitely can impact their ability to stay focused, to stay alert, to stay engaged. Their strength is influenced by this. And if because of that, then they are not able to make academic progress and it's negatively impacting their educational performance, and then what they need is some specially designed instruction to help them gain access to the gen ed curriculum, they might be eligible. So the other one is the specific learning disability. And again, that is sometimes it can be dyslexia. You don't need a formal diagnosis, but it's an example of a kind of specific learning disability. And so they would look for that. So what I would say is, think about as much as you can, understand about this child. No, it's not your job, and indeed alone you won't be able to say, this is their eligibility category. But if you're able to say, here's why I'm worried, and here's why I think they might be eligible, I'm looking at this, and here's what I see in them. If you're able to point out those connections, it might get you to a different response on the decision to evaluate or the decision for eligibility. The other thing really in this situation, whatever the particulars, right? Let's say you have made the request for an evaluation and you've done it again, because having been told no before does not mean you can't ask again, and it doesn't mean that the answer again is necessarily no. So you would have written a request by email, perhaps. This says request for a special ed evaluation, and you would have said, these are my concerns. And then you would have said, please let me know if we can meet to talk and what the next step is. You would then watch for and make sure that you get written notice of the decision to evaluate or not. Let's move over to our Learn About page on supports for students with disabilities. And here, I'm going to highlight a relatively new toolkit, right? So we went to oeo.wa.gov, and we went to Learn About, and we went to Services for our Students with Disabilities. And here we've put in our request for an evaluation, doing it in writing, and we're waiting to hear back, right? They're going to have 25 school days to decide whether or not to evaluate. And then let's say they agree to evaluate, and then we're going to go to the evaluation meeting, and then we are going to look for the prior written notice. And this is a written document from the district to you after a decision is made, before it's implemented. It's required under the special ed rules for decisions on evaluation, identification, placement. It has to include the reasons for the decision, okay? And if you get a prior written notice, we included in here a few examples. Number one, what if you don't get one? Thank you for talking with me about this. Please send me one. Number two, you had a meeting, now you're waiting. Thank you for meeting. Please send me the prior written notice. And then number three, which happens sometimes, thank you for the meeting and the documents and the prior written notice. I'm looking at it and it does not include certain information. This is just an example. Please don't be shy about asking for a more complete or accurate prior written notice, especially around decisions to evaluate or not evaluate. You really want to understand where they're coming from so you can then assess, you can check in with someone else. Does this sound right? Is there something else I can raise to kind of change this conversation? So there's no guarantee that there would be eligibility, but by really focusing on written advocacy, not letting go until you get the written response with the reasons, and then trying to process where that has left you, maybe we'll get you to a different outcome for this young student. So let's go back to our slideshow. So again, you shouldn't need a medical diagnosis. Think about the different definitions for eligibility and do that written advocacy. The other benefit is if you do that written advocacy and you've gotten your written notice and response and you wanted to say, hey, what do you think about this? You could easily share that written notice with someone. They could take a look and say, well, that makes sense. And I can see why they're going this way. Or they could say, that doesn't seem consistent with me. Let's talk about circling back to them. So you can get input from another person on it. All right. Navigating different responses to escalating behavior. This one, so what if the question is really kind of comes in as, supporting teenagers and teens in care, and they're in high school. Some schools, right? Again, we circle back to our earlier conversation about trauma-informed approaches. Some schools really focus first on relationship. They might have a lead person who, I don't know how best to describe it, but it seems like some elements of that they're firm, and yet they very clearly care about this person, this young person. They know them, they care about them, they're thinking of them as someone who deserves their respect. And maybe I think one of the elements that seems to come up is when you're dealing with adolescents anywhere, teenagers, is this idea of who's in control. And then in here, I'm going to go outside my area of expertise, but if you add that you've been impacted by trauma, that you're in care, being able to maintain control over what you can become really important. And so what might seem like some little thing to an adult who's not in that world, like, hey, the rule here is you don't wear your hat. I tell you to take your hat off, you take your hat off. That's just it. I'm the one who sets the rules. I'm the one who tells you what they are. And if you're going to ignore me or you're going to talk back to me, then you've got even more problem. If I approach it that way, and this is a young person who's got a whole bunch of other stuff going on, and for whatever reason, that one issue of take your hat off just is triggering something else, that assertion of control and power sometimes can lead to an escalation that you look back on it and it just feels like there's no way that was necessary, right? No way that's the best outcome for everyone. And it's not that we want to ignore the general rules that are set up, because we're going to assume they're there for a reason, but we also got to appreciate that we need flexibility to deal with the various real experiences of young people who are in schools. So what do you do, though, if you're in a school that feels like it has a rigid approach or a very punitive approach? What can you do? And I think sometimes there, one of the things is to think about, has the district developed a team? Again, I didn't put it on this slide, but I would think about reaching out to the foster care liaison. Has the issue of how schools are going to approach discipline with foster students come up in conversation in this district before? Does the district have a behavior intervention team that could come in and do some work with the school? Has there been a functional behavior assessment? Ultimately, can we try to have a conversation around agreeing on some shared goals that are really student focused? Let's help this student get to success, right? And then what we want to look at is, has a traditional approach or a rigid or punitive approach to discipline helped us get closer to that? And usually the answer is going to be really no, because a punitive approach often will separate the youth again from that setting, from the adults who they might otherwise be trying to form relationships with. So those questions usually lead us back to trying to really understand the why of behavior, really try to form relationships that can kind of give a context and a safer place to kind of do that push and pull a little bit when those issues come up. Sometimes I think, I didn't include it here, but one of the resources that's come up around adolescent teen behavior, even younger kids, is an approach of collaborative problem solving. It's a particular approach, and there's a lot of resources about it. One of the keys to it is that part of the process starts by talking and agreeing, the young person and the adult together, that the behavior that you want to address is a problem, right? Or the fact that this behavior is happening is a problem that you both have interest in addressing. Because if you can get the teen to say, yeah, I agree that it's a problem, that I sometimes get so frustrated that I lash out or I become aggressive. And I agree that's a problem because I agree I want to get through school and that's just not going to work. If you can agree on that, then if you can bring the adult as well to say, okay, let's commit each other to doing some stuff that will make it less likely that that will happen and give you some tools when you do start to feel escalated. I don't have a quick, easy answer, but again, think about those folks who within the school or within the district might have that understanding and appreciation for how trauma can impact a child. I wouldn't be hesitant either, especially, let's say, if you can connect with an organization, if you can connect with a larger conversation. This situation reminds me that data on discipline is easily accessible now on OSPI's website. And so bear with me for another journey to the side. And let's take a look. On OSPI's website, we now, and I'm just going to type in, and so if you wanted to do this at home, I'm going to type, pretend this is Google, OSPI data, and here you can see it's going to pop right up on my screen because I look at it sometimes, discipline. They have this page called OSPI Performance Indicators and Discipline Rates. So it took us right to it. You can find this on OSPI's website, and one of the elements of what they have here is that they have now disaggregated data by different student groups, by different behaviors, by other things. And I don't think you are all going to be surprised. I'm going to click on this gap piece here. I'm not always sure exactly how. If we go to a district detail, let's choose a district. And, sorry, Seattle, but you are my district, so let's choose you. We'll choose Seattle. Well, actually, we don't even have to. We'll stick to statewide, but you can choose your individual district, and I wouldn't hesitate. It's information. It's not a complete story, but it's information. You're going to see up here, we have school year, we have the district. We can look at long-term, short-term expulsions all together, or all of them, all behavior types, and then we can look at subgroups. And here, you can either look at race, ethnicity breakdowns, or you can look at all other subgroups. And one of the things that we're going to start to see, we don't see it yet, but in the future, we're probably going to start to see youth in care, or foster care youth. One of the things this does show us is what is the overall rate of discipline. And we can see, if we look at this quickly, the lines that stick out to us, and we just, whoa, what's going on? Look closer. Our youth who are experiencing homelessness and young people receiving special education services, right? And if you do choose a district, so let's go ahead and do that. I'll choose my home district of Seattle. If you do choose Seattle, for example, it's going to update. And then what it also can do is it can show you how does your district do comparatively to statewide averages. And wow, I just noticed something different here for Seattle. The longest graph is for migrant kids. So kids who are moving, and then homeless kids, and students with special education and low-income kids. So why are we even looking at this? Because again, if you are concerned about practice, policy, patterns, this kind of data can and should be part of an overall conversation of looking at it. And it might not be the first conversation you want to have with the school community, but I think as you engage over time, and you're finding people who are really committed to trying to get better outcomes for kids, you really ought to be able to engage with this data with them. I know that districts are being encouraged and trained and led to look at their own data. And I believe very strongly that to really get good learning from data, to really understand sort of what might be contributing, what could we do differently, what is this telling us, those conversations should include families and students and community folks, because I think it's that kind of thing where if you're right in the middle of it, it's really hard to see yourself. So having a whole bunch of different perspectives, looking and engaging that data together, I think can lead you to more interesting and potentially more helpful questions about what might be contributing. So this is where you'd find, again, you can Google OSPI data discipline. They have a whole bunch of different data resources on their data and analytics page. And this is just the state level. Each district is going to have more specific data, different subgroups, different school level. And data, again, is not a whole story, but it is a tool to kind of take a look at that. Look at, even if what we mean to be doing is supporting each and every student, what have we actually been doing in terms of discipline? How many of those students are out? So that is my data soapbox for now. Let's shift back a little bit. We have a good question, an added question here, and I know we are getting closer to the end. So I want to bump this one in, and then then we'll move to the next one. But we have a question: what if a child who's severely autistic or has a significant severe autism spectrum disorder is turning 18, and they're saying it's time to go to the transition program? He's not verbal, he's nonverbal, he still is not using the bathroom independently, so not potty trained, and has severe behavior issues. So what can you do if you're worried that transition program is not going to be set up to support that student's needs, right? And it's identifying a pretty significant collection of needs. So a nonverbal student, my other question when I hear that a student is nonverbal, one of the questions I often ask next is, have you or has the school been able to develop a communication system that works pretty well? So some students are nonverbal, but they are really using an augmentative communication device, right? It might be an iPad with a certain program that they've been trained to use and that others with them have been trained to use, that they use pretty regularly, or some might use sign plus that. But if a student is nonverbal and there really hasn't yet been the successful development of a communication system, whether it's high tech or low tech, that's tough, right? Imagine yourself in your body with all kinds of things going on, and you don't have a way to tell other people what's going on with you or what you need, what you feel, much less what you're dreaming about, what you're imagining, what you wish for, right? That's tough. And so I think it's not surprising that you see behavior become the primary means of communication, and it might distill down to those most intense needs or emotions, and so behavior issues come up. My first thought in a situation like this would be, has there been a recent evaluation? Is there a good, clear understanding of where this young person's at now, what their needs are? Start with that evaluation, and then you can have that conversation. Gosh, does this roadmap of his individual needs, does that flow right into that transition program? Because if it doesn't, we need to talk about how we then create something else, find another option, build something that meets those needs. And so in a situation like that, definitely encourage, feel free to reach out for some more individual conversation. Transition is one of our strategic priorities this year, so we try to be responsive and work with families on that if we can. Yeah, because I think there should not be any sort of automatic transfer of a student to a particular program just because they reach a particular age. Some transition programs are the right fit for some kids and not for all, and that doesn't mean that the kid doesn't still need a really robust transition program. Yeah, they do have a communication device, but not functional skills. I cannot emphasize enough that, you know, sometimes a student will have an iPad. At some point, it was written into their IEP. At some point, they got that, but it just has not really become a functioning tool. And there could be all kinds of reasons. I want to highlight another resource. And so again, this is one to know about, but you don't have to be the expert. But if you know about it, you can ask about it and say, what about this? And that is the Special Education Technology Center for Assistive Technology in Special Education. Again, the Special Education Technology Center that supports districts in understanding, evaluating, and meeting the needs for assistive technology for kids who receive special education services. Oh, I just can't help it. You know, I'm going back to the web. So, and I'm just going to type it in, Special Education Technology Center. I happen to know it's at Central. I'm going to put it in Central, see if we get it pulled up here. Special Education Technology Center. This is a center that's located at Central Washington University in Ellensburg. And it was created, it's been around for a while. It was what's called a state needs program. So our state OSPI invested in it to help give technical support to districts on assistive technology. This really is a resource that as a parent, you're probably not going to call them directly, but what you'd want to know is to say to the district, we need to work out this, we need to figure out a communication system, not just that they have, but that they know how to use. So can we look at training on this? Can we look at a reassessment? Is this the right device? Can we look at training for the staff on how to train them? My other favorite thing here is that they have webinars that they've recorded, right? Just like they're getting in on the webinar piece because they have a lot of information that's useful. One of their webinars is actually around a team approach to communication. And it talks about how critical it is that if you have a young person who relies on a device for communication, it is so important that they are learning how to use that device and they're practicing it in the classroom, and that it can go with them to home, right? Because you want them to have a communication system they can use at school, at home, in the community. And so it talks about that teaming approach. If you don't have to memorize this place. If you just remember that there is such a thing as a place where districts can get support on assistive technology, including those communication devices, trainings, evaluations, that sort of thing, you can ask about it. And again, if you're hitting roadblocks, you can call our office and other organizations that provide support. But don't be shy about thinking about that and asking. Some districts will be, yes, let's go give them a call. Our other question, and this one, I know we're getting closer to time. I really wanted to make sure we hit this one because I think it probably comes up more often than we realize, and I think it's maybe one of those issues that if we can be proactive and work with school districts and with the state to kind of really understand and help share out best practice and information and just actually have a conversation. And I keep talking around it, but it's this idea that sometimes I'm hearing, you know, well, we have this child who has experienced trauma and they're having a hard time in school. We don't want to rush to evaluate or rush to label as disabled when it might be the impacts of trauma that they will work through. There's actually a lot of interesting stuff on this. I don't know if anybody here had followed that, and it's been a couple years back in Oakland, a group actually brought a lawsuit and said that the exposure to trauma among the students in Oakland was so high that the district should acknowledge that it created a disability and that those students were entitled to accommodations rather than just facing straight up discipline, right? So they had a student population with high exposure to traumatic events, and the district's responses sometimes were not based with accommodations and trauma-informed responses. So they were talking about this, is exposure to trauma, does that cause a disability, or is it a disability? So this relationship, this question of, is a child with high ACEs, does that equal disability? Or could you have a child who has been impacted by trauma and has a disability? How do you make sense of that? And one of the things I hope that we don't fall into is an idea that it's always going to be either or, because I think it's often going to be both and understanding that relationship is going to be important. I also hope that indeed we don't want to, I think there's concern about disproportionate or over-identification of students as having disabilities. On the other hand, if we can do some work and make improvements in systems that serve the needs of students with disabilities, then accidentally identifying someone as a student with a disability when they really might have just needed some additional supports and time to work through wouldn't be something that sets them up on a negative pathway, right? In other words, let's say there is a child who's experienced trauma. Maybe it's not so severe and long-lasting that they would be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but that it influences and sets them back academically. They get identified and eligible, they get some supports, and then a year later, 2 years later, they're in a stable situation, they're caught up, they're doing fine. What we do then is reevaluate, and they may exit special ed services, right? Versus a risk, if there's a child who's experienced significant trauma, they're having a really hard time in school, they're not keeping up academically, behavior is becoming a challenge, relationships are difficult, and we say, let's wait a year, see what happens. Sometimes waiting can put them further behind, can make it more difficult to build relationships. It can add to that list of behavior incidents that has just been piling up in their record, right? So we kind of dig deeper unless we're giving some really individualized, targeted supports. So I don't know if my instinct on this matches everyone, but I do think that there's a couple things to think about. One is, and the question was, what do I do if there's a child in care? They've been moving around a lot, so yes, they're behind, but we're worried about them. We want to ask for an evaluation, but the district is saying, no, let's not rush. I don't think that's where we need to go. Let's address this as a child who's experienced trauma and see what happens. So the delay is on even the evaluation, right? That's key, right? The distinction between, are we going to delay evaluation, or after evaluation, are we going to make a careful determination about whether there is a disability here that's at play, right? So the question I would encourage is to, again, go to your written advocacy, be clear that you're asking for an evaluation, and again, we're going to jump back to the website because we want to take a look at the child with a disability definition, because it could be that the child, because of the trauma, if it has impacted them in a way that they meet that definition of a child with a disability, because of that trauma, they might be eligible for special education and the impact it's had on them. It could be that in addition to the trauma, this is a child with another disability, and we don't want to miss that. We don't want to delay evaluation. But how can we answer that if we don't do the evaluation, right? And so that's a key thing. Sometimes we'll hear, no, we don't want to evaluate because they've had gaps in their education, they've missed a lot of school. Well, absolutely, if the reason they're behind is because they've missed a lot of school, not because they have a disability, then they would not qualify for special education. They'd need other academic supports to help them catch up. But I want to take a look here and show you that actually, if we go back to our website, and we're going to go back to our special ed rules, and we're going to pop up here, and we're going to look at the eligibility section, and we're just going to eligibility determinations. Here it is, determination of eligibility. A student must not be determined eligible for special ed services if the determinant factor, so the primary factor, is lack of appropriate instruction in reading or in math or limited English proficiency, and the student doesn't otherwise meet eligibility criteria. Okay, so it's an and, right? So what if you have a child in foster care, has missed a lot of school, and is an English learner? Could they still be eligible for special education? Yes, they could, because it could be that this is a child with autism that is getting a late diagnosis because they didn't have access to medical assessment or care. It could be because they have very severe ADHD and they are not going to be able to concentrate and focus and participate. It could be that they have an emotional or behavior disorder that is the primary factor interfering now with their education. So this is an eligibility question, and it doesn't say that any kid who's missed a lot of school can't be qualified for special ed. So again, it's eligibility, it's not whether we're doing the evaluation. That's a key thing to engage that conversation around and to ask for the written follow-up. And the other key thing, again, is to go back. I'm scrolling back to the top. I'm looking back at our definition. And again, one of the categories of eligibility for special education services is emotional behavior disorder or disability. And now it does have some very specific parts to the definition. It's a student who exhibits certain characteristics over a long period of time and to a marked degree. And so it's not sort of a short-term kind of thing. So yeah, it might be that if this is new and that's the only thing at issue, you might be waiting a little while to see what's going on. Does this continue? You would hopefully be doing interventions in the meantime. But if you're talking about, can we get an evaluation to really try to understand, then I would urge you to try to have that conversation or reach out to someone to join that conversation on the distinction between a decision to evaluate and then after that's done and you actually have information, then the care that you use around eligibility determinations. I hope that makes sense. And I spend a little time on that because I do think it comes up, and I think sometimes it does contribute to a delay in really understanding a student's needs. And then if we assume that once we really understand that, we can do the team can do some really good planning and effective interventions, then the idea is the sooner the better to get that identified. The other thing I had on this slide that I thought about, which is helpful to remember, so you might have this young person, they've been moving around a lot, lots of different schools, so it might not be in their school records only that you're going to get a sense of whether, is this something new or was this there before? And so to gather information from various sources, this might be the time when you really want to kind of canvass who knew this child earlier, what was going on then, who saw this child in these other settings, do we see it over there too? So you're asking not just at school, but you're asking more broadly to try to understand, is this something, again, is this something new? Or is this something that we've had a concern about over time? In which case that weighs in favor of saying, let's get that evaluation and we'll take some time and care at the eligibility determination. Folks, I've taken you to 7:28. That means we have 2 minutes left on the clock, and that was an hour and a half. I did not leave enough time for some open Q&A. I'm gonna, we have a couple other questions, but I'm afraid I'm not going to get to them. You're welcome to contact us again separately. The one other thing I want to note is there's one of the links on this other slide here is about an article on trauma-informed practices in the IEP process. So there are people who are looking at the connection here and trying to share some helpful ideas. Questions? Last questions? This is our one more minute, and if you want to put out one more question, I'll do my best. And well, thank you for the thank you. That makes the wrap up easier. If you have other situations, if you're working with an individual student and you still have questions, give us a call at 1-866-297-2597. And thank you so much.